rather than from the head down. And that's also because of things that we have learned about the structure of memory. Now, the reason why memory is not, for me, a foreign, alien category is that in the ancient world, education was virtually equated with how much you knew by heart, how much you had memorized, how many speeches you knew, how many stories you knew, how much of Homer you knew so that you could recite it. And an educated person was a person who had a large repertoire of things that they had learned by heart. So the great rhetoricians would know a whole variety of speeches, which they could then draw on and were related to and part of then a body of material that they knew and then could improvise, could develop, retell in a variety of ways. So biblical storytelling and building a repertoire of stories is a process of interiorization, of getting it into the brain, into heart, into the gut, into the moves, so that there's a kind of holistic appropriation. Now, basic memory research on the structures of human memory has been an ongoing research area for contemporary psychology. But there are some basic principles that have emerged from that have continued to shape memory research. The first of these is that memory is, first of all, the recording of data in the sensory registers. And there are in the brain 5 different centers, that is, sensory registers. So sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. So each of these senses has a register in the brain that is constantly registering the data of that sense. You can notice that right now. Notice what you're hearing, what you can see. Notice the smells in the room. Notice the touch of how your butt feels on the chair, how your clothes feel on your body, the tastes that are residual from dinner, and so you can even sort those. You can probably sort the cherry Danish and the barbecued chicken and stuff, and you can, if you pay attention, those registers, that sensory data is there. So what happens is that there is a constant stream of sensory data that is being registered by those sensory registers in the brain. It's going on all the time. Now, what gets to short-term memory is, first of all, shaped by attention. So stuff comes from here, and it gets determined by what you pay attention to. Now, attention is one of the most difficult things to manage because it's so easy to get distracted. And the it's also that in relation to a story, that we tend to limit our attention to one sense or another. I'm basically a sound-oriented guy. And so I'm, first of all, always paying attention to the sound of the stories. And I'm a musician. I regularly learn music by heart. And so I'm constantly paying attention to the sound of the story. But the sight of the story also helps. So to chart out a story, to imagine and to see the story in your mind's eye, that also is, for many people, very helpful. But another thing that gets built into, potentially in the story, are the smells of the story. What are the fragrances, the odors that are associated with the story, the tastes, but especially the touches. The movement, one of the sources of memory is to memorize, to learn movements, and to establish a move that's associated with a particular part of a story is very helpful in terms of being able to remember it. So people will, as part of learning a story, develop places in their imaginary storytelling space for different parts of the story. And so you might move here for the story of the trial, but then go over here for Peter's denial and looking down, and then to another spot for the pilot trial and so on. Or in the case of some of those stories, you can move more. Those are dimensions of touch, of physical engagement with the story. One of the things that has been discovered is that the more data of different kinds that are noticed, but that are related to the story, the more it will be remembered. The richness of them, the range of sensory registers, contributes to and gives the brain more places to connect with the story than if it's limited just to one sense. So that's kind of a basic principle in relation to sensory registers. Now, in relation to attention, what has become clear from the study of memory is that attention really fast. So if, for example, kind of a classic story, if you're, we don't even do this anymore. In the old days, when you were standing at a telephone and asking the operator for a number, and so you'd hear the number, and you'd start to recite, let's see, that number is 937, and I'm going to write it down as 937. And just in the midst of that, after you'd gotten the number, somebody says, "Watch out!" And you turn around and there's a car, coming or whatever. That memory is gone. That is, it is totally erased. And that can happen instantly with any significant major distraction. So the business of attention is always a matter of focus and of not allowing distractions to keep you from paying attention to the specific data that are being registered by the sensory registers. So attention is a major factor in what gets to then the workbench of short-term memory. Now, what happens is that there is a constant sorting. What? Snort terms. Okay.
Short term.
There is a constant processing of material, of sensory data through the sensory registers and what is paid attention to, which is sometimes involuntary. That is, when there are traumatic events, they simply take attention. And if it's a particularly traumatic event, it will be instantly stored in long-term memory. So I remember the moment before I was hit by a car. That is a moment that is forever written in my long-term memory. I remember the dream that I had when I was 7 years old and had an emergency appendectomy. As I was getting ether, I had a dream of a little elf in a green suit jumping back and forth between a piece of bubble gum with a little platform on each end, and it was going, he was real happy. He was going boing, 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 boing. And I remember that vividly because I didn't know whether I was going to wake up again. I knew I was really sick, and it was close.
You know, I had something similar, but it wasn't that specific. It was like a mix of sights and sounds and colors, almost like in Fantasia for the toccata and fugue.
Yes.
About, you know, this was all going on. Pretty soon there was a deep black hole, and I was.
Oh no!
But I was 8. So how old were you?
7.
But I wasn't afraid. It just and it happened fast.
Yeah. Well, I have a vivid memory of a little pool table that I got for Christmas, and I remember going out, seeing it under the Christmas tree. I could draw, reconstruct that room where the tree was on the dining room table, where the pool table was. It was just sheer magic. And so those things go straight into long-term memory because they're so vivid. And but that's something that really gets your attention. But for the most part, most of the things that we do, and this is the nature of the difference between a trained memory and an untrained memory, is that a trained memory knows how to process things through the short-term or through the sensory registers, through short-term memory to long-term memory. So that's what we're working on in relation to this, the structures of memory. Now, the characteristics of short-term memory. It is limited. So
Don't we know?
you can hold in short-term memory 7 pieces of data easily. So then, but the maximum is 10. So how many numbers are there in a phone number in the US?
7.
With the area code?
10.
Precisely. And that's why. That is, they wanted to have as many numbers as could be held in short-term memory. And it was then pushing the limit. So the basic limit was 7. And then to add another 3 for the area code was then the extent of the capacity of long-term memory. Now,
what about a person who's very gifted in math or in geometry, physics, whatever? I have the feeling that they must remember a lot more than I can conceive.
well, one of the things that determines, that shapes short-term memory is what is called chunking. So it is possible, for example, to have chunks of many items that are held in short-term memory as one thing. So, for example, with a phone number, you can think of a phone number as 3 numbers: 937-648-9084.
Yes.
So it's not 10 numbers, it's 3.
Yes.
Or you can think of that number as 1 number. That's tougher, but it's fully possible for the brain to do that. Mathematicians, chess masters, storytellers develop the ability to build bigger and bigger chunks that can then be held in short-term memory. Sure.
You mean not? Oh, okay. Well, we remember things in long-term memory if we have hooks. And so the more knowledge you get in a particular field, that is the more things you've learned and that are in your memory. The more hooks there are to get other data on. So that's a person who becomes an expert in the field of mathematics just has more there to help them remember anything that's new.
And I tended to blame my poor performance in math and geometry and all that on not having good memory. And there must have been some other things. The teachers were lousy, I know that.
Maybe you were highly motivated.
Well, and my hunch is that if you had learned some of the principles of training memory in relation to the mastery of sets of numbers, of groups of numbers, of theorems, and thinking about those in different ways, that you would have been able to perform better in math. And one of the problems that is present in both math and language is that the teachers have not been introduced to memory and how it works. So
I want to show you actually do one
right.
Yeah. This is that thing we were talking about, the recap, different ways of getting
right.
So
Okay. Good.
Yep. But I did a lot better in history and almost all of the subjects.
Yeah.
I chunked a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's in the way.
Okay. All right. So chunking then. So for example, chess masters.
Move it over there. Just move it.
Okay. Chess masters are able to, for example, learn the 20 moves of the Sicilian defense and then variations on that. Of 20 moves as 1 chunk. They can study and see the moves on a chessboard and then approach that and learn that as 1 chunk. So and that's possible with biblical stories. Rather than thinking of the cola and periods as, for example, in the story that we learned this afternoon, rather than thinking of immediately, early in the morning, the chief priests, the scribes, the elders, and the whole Sanhedrin, rather than thinking of that as 12 words, whatever it is, you think of it as 1 word. And so the old line, supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, is also true for biblical stories. You can think of the story of Peter's denial as having 12 words, 4 episodes with 3 periods in each episode. So it's just 12 words. You can hold virtually the whole story in short-term memory by chunking in that way. So so one of the basic techniques of then short-term memory is chunking materials, so that then instead of and it's all in how you think. It really doesn't have anything objectively to do with what the character of the material is. It's how you think about it and how you process it then in short-term memory. So the more you can do that, more you can hold in short-term memory at one time.
And I found in the Golden Calf story that it was fairly easy to memorize the animation when Moses comes into the camp and what he does.
Mhm.
Extreme action.
Right,
Mhm.
right,
Touch.
right.
Yeah.
The gesture and the feel of that.
Yeah, I want to get down and pick up the pieces of the shattered
Right.
tablets.
Yeah. Well, another way of keeping things in short-term memory, which is the major way that people use, is repetition.
Yeah.
Now, the value of repetition is not for storage in long-term memory. You won't learn anything by just repeating. But it does keep things on the workbench of short-term memory so that you can then process it. But that's important to realize, because people think that the way that they'll memorize something is to repeat it 15 times. Now, in the piano, I'm a pianist, there is the reality of building muscle.
Right, and I think you do that with your mouth too.
Right. So you can do that with gestures and so on. And repeating a difficult passage 15 times so that it literally gets into the muscles of the fingers, so that it will move that way easily, so that you can just remember that move, and it's all one move. The repetition does help. But in relation to storytelling, the primary function of repetition is to keep the story in short-term memory so that you can then start to store it in on the data banks of long-term memory.
Yeah, you have to draw the data banks.
Oh, I haven't gotten there yet. Another dimension of short-term memory, and you were just naming that, Norman, is exaggeration.
Yeah, write the on there so they get the
Here,
on the side.
repetition.
And underline the first letter of each word.
Thank you. Why? What are you talking about?
It spells recap, which will help you remember those basic stuff. Put repetition first.
Cap is
It's an, it's an example of one of the techniques of learning.
Well, it's too late. All right. And pictures. So all of those help the process of short-term memory. Chunking, repetition, exaggeration, attention, and pictures. So
is the exaggeration in the story or in you when you tell it?
it's both. First is recognizing when there's exaggeration in the story. So one of the things that emerges from a performance criticism study is that there are major differences in volume. So in the story of the pilot trial, the crowd shouted, "Crucify him!" There is often in a story a crescendo. So usually when there is a repetition of 3, that is an indication of a crescendo, as each of the repeated elements gets louder and louder. That's the case in the story of Peter's denial. The first denial, around the fire. The second one, he's one of them. The third is, they said you're a Galilean, and he invoked a curse on himself. So it's a crescendo of, and the last one is really exaggerated. So sometimes it's in the story, but sometimes it's something that you just do because it helps you to fix it in your mind.
How about
Jesus
the woe
was
man?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The woe man of Adam and Eve.
I like
That's
that.
a good example.
Whoa, man. That's
Whoa.
right. Yeah. So, what happens with long-term memory or short-term memory is that the memories get exaggerated and build up. Jesus was a master of that, of creating parables, metaphors that were exaggerated. So why do you notice the speck or the thing in your brother's eye and don't notice the log in your own eye?
Yeah.
So, you know, it's a
30,
that
60,
exaggeration.
100-fold.
Yeah, right. So those things function to enable then short-term memory. Now, what happens, and the most difficult thing, is the storage on the shelves of long-term memory. So this is characteristics of long-term memory. Infinite capacity. It, as far as memory researchers have been able to determine, there are no limits to human long-term memory. It is virtually infinite in its capacity. And there are huge amounts of material stored in our long-term memory. The issue is to be able to retrieve it. And we know it's there because we regularly have the experience of suddenly remembering something that we didn't even know was in our long-term memory. So I remember when I moved back to Ohio from New York, I was driving through the countryside, and suddenly there was this fragrance of burning leaves in the fall. And instantly, there were all these memories of football games, of this girl, that girl, of dates, of times driving through the countryside, of the moon on a fall night, and the unique coolness of those evenings. It all came flooding back. I didn't even know that it was in my memory. That's what often happens with psychoanalysis. That's one of the reasons why Freud had his patients lie down so that they could free associate. And what they would come up with is that they would discover things in their long-term memory that they didn't know were there, which in turn, when processed, helped them to identify trauma, to work through it, and bring it to consciousness. So
Association.
yes, it is.
I just realized that when you said that.
Yeah, right. So, infinite capacity, problem of retrieval. Now, the way that things are stored in long-term memory, there are two basic systems for retrieval. One is episodic. A way of learning a story and of recording it in long-term memory is to store it as episodes. So that's why it makes sense to think through a story episodically, and that's why I print it that way. So if you look at your sound maps that I gave you, they are printed in easily identified chunks that are the cola and periods. They're arranged in episodes so that you can see then the units of the story. And what I often do when I'm learning a new story is I will give a name to each episode, and or an image or both, and perhaps a place or a move, so that I can then record this story episodically, and I can then, with any story, for example, right now, I can remember in Mark's Gospel, I can go to any place in the story and identify what comes before and what follows it. That's the result of episodic storage of the story in long-term memory. So I can think about it as a series of episodes, one after another. That's how we remember the story of our lives. You can now think about and recall the memories you have of your childhood, of elementary school, high school, college, graduate school, Middle Ages, so on.
In the golden calf story, it's directional: up, down, the mountain, the camp, the mountain, the camp.
Yeah, yep.
Moses, Aaron, Moses, Aaron.
Well, that may be more the next thing.
Right. So that is sequential storage. So when you're learning a story, then you want to name the episodes and think those episodes, so that you literally store the words with the episodic structure. That's why I, at the beginning of teaching a story, name the structure, because it gives you then episodic units to store in long-term memory. And a way then of recalling a story is to remember the episodes. Now, another clue in regard to the interiorization of biblical stories is that it's helpful to remember, identify, pay attention to the first words of each episode. So if you can get the first word and retrieve that, the rest of the episode will be there. All you need is a link to that episode in your long-term memory, and much of the rest of it will be there. Now, the other way that things are stored in long-term memory is what is called syntactic. Syntactic is long-term memory storage according to concepts or ideas. So,
I've got the up, down idea.
healing stories, stories of feedings, stories of encounter with others, Pharisees, whatever. You can identify the syntax. Another way of thinking about that is the words that are repeated. And so repeated words can be a syntactical link. In Mark's Gospel, the Passion prophecies, especially the third one, serves as a syntactical link to the stories of the Passion. So Jesus, the last of his prophecies is, the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders, and they will condemn him to death and hand him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him, spit on him, beat him, and kill him. and on the third day you will be raised. Now, each of those phrases is repeated word for word in a story that goes through the Passionary. And so, if you learn that prophecy, it can serve as syntactical links to those stories in their sequence through the gospel, through the Passion.
And in terms of repetition in Exodus, on both sides of that golden calf story, the instructions are given on how to make the tabernacle and all the appointments, and it goes on for chapters. Then you have the golden calf incident. Then when Moses picks up tablets again, same thing begins to happen, only this time it is told that it's done, instructed how to do it, and then doing it. So those instructions, there's no need that I say to myself as a reader, particularly, I don't know what it would be for learning. I wouldn't try to learn the tabernacle building. The story has to be important to you.
Right. And so if you're going to build a tabernacle, or if you're going to conceptualize it and use it as a way of structuring activities or ideas, then there is a reason to learn that. And that's one of the things the rabbis did in the Midrash.
Yes.
Is that they would take those things and build them into a system, memory system, that would serve them as links to long-term memory for various things. I've noticed that also in Acts, that there's this story of Peter and Cornelius, Roman centurion, and of the sheep being let down, and then and Peter commanded to take and eat, and then the people come from Cornelius's house in Caesarea. He's in Joppa, and so Peter goes and enters the house, and the gift of the Holy Spirit is given to his household, and they are baptized and have dinner together. Big deal. The next story is that the Jerusalem council heard about this and interrogated Peter, and some of the brothers said, "Why are you doing this? Why did you go and eat with a Gentile?" And so then Peter told the story about what had happened. Well, it's a repetition of the same story, but now it's told by Peter in the context of being interrogated by people who were hostile about it. So the first is the report, then is Peter's report to the Jerusalem council. So the syntactical structure, the episodic structure, and the syntax of the elements that are the same in the story make the learning of the second story a lot easier. And the same would be true if you were trying to learn both of those tabernacle things. So I'm not recommending it, but it would make it a lot easier. It would make it possible.
There's, the little trick if you can't think of somebody's name, you go through the alphabet.
Oh, yeah, I do that.
Okay. So which one of those would it be, or is it a whole different thing?
Go through the alphabet and what?
Okay, like say you can't think of somebody's name, and you go A, B, C, D. Oh,
See if I
David.
get it.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
What is the wife's name? Tom's wife's name.
Okay, Amelia.
Yeah.
Probably like a association. You got the first, or an,
But it's a
can't
syntactical
say that word,
association.
Right.
like a mnemonic device.
Yes, so you can structure it as a mnemonic device. Yeah. But it's one that's organized by syntax, by the syntax of letters. The same would be true for the syntax of words or concepts. So you could also try to recall a name by dentists. You can see what dentists are, doctors, or friends, or members of the board, or whatever. So those are stored then, and that's what's important. The function of these links is to identify them consciously so that they get stored in long-term memory, and you can identify how to get them back. The problem isn't that they aren't there. They're there. The problem is you can't retrieve them. And so what these syntactical and episodic connections do is they enable you to retrieve the materials that are in long-term memory. And there's a lot more there than we can retrieve. So that's a basic principle for interiorization. And training and practicing that is a good idea. It's especially a good idea for people as they age. The brain is like any other muscle. You use it or you lose it. And there has been research that has demonstrated, for example, that musicians who continue to memorize new music there is a statistical fact that they develop dementia and Alzheimer's at a much lower rate than people who do not continue to learn by heart. That is, it's a process that if you keep pushing it, it works. So that's kind of the basic structure of memory. And the process of training memory is then the process of doing this all the time. It's not something you do just for emergencies. It's something that you work at. However, the reality of my life has been I learn stories by heart in order to tell them at a time when I've made a commitment, I'm going to tell this story. Or when, for example, as happened a week ago last Sunday, somebody was supposed to tell the story, and inaccurately as it turned out, pastor thought that I was the one who was going to do it. So I had a half an hour to learn this major story in Acts, which was the second of Peter's and Cornelius' story. So I had a half an hour. And I had it, I would have been fine. As it turned out, once I was starting to practice it, another person in the congregation had already volunteered to learn it. She was ready to tell it. Said, okay, so it was all in vain. But I found that there would have been some pauses as I sorted through whatever, but I would have made it. Now, another thing that is clear about that process is the more you learn, the easier it is to learn. People are steadily amazed at my ability to learn biblical stories quickly. That's true. But it's because of the factor that Amelia identified just a moment ago. The more stories you know, the more links you have in long-term memory, and the more you can recognize the patterns that are present in the story. And so you have a whole series of links that make it possible then to learn stories much more rapidly because you become familiar with the patterns of biblical storytelling. And there are definite patterns.
The three is really important.
That's right.
Or you just have hooks in there.
Yeah.
It's not like you have the same character that you had someplace else. It's just easier to remember.
Right. So like the structure of the rhetoric of involvement and implication. If you recognize that rhetoric and that structure, then you can store the story in episodic and syntactic links much more easily, and therefore it makes it easier to retrieve and to remember. So that's it. Any questions, comments?
Well, I'm thinking about the list of names in Chronicles. I got started thinking about that because I was listening to a Christian radio program when I was driving one time, and they were reading the Bible through, and the guy was reading Chronicles, the list of the names in Chronicles. And I thought, my God, who's interested in that? Who would undertake? I even doubt that the rabbis, when they get to that, remember them. It's broken, like here, only by a few little notes, like the families of the Zorathites in the names. One guy more honorable than his brother. These were craftsmen. These are the daughters of Pharaoh. Linen workers. So on. Every now and then you get something like that, but nothing quite.
Could be
Well, and the list of names at the end of it's either Ezra or Nehemiah.
Yes, you have them there too.
Yeah, long lists of names of those
Yeah.
who put aside foreign wives and vowed and signed the covenant.
just
Mark?
Two things. There is a interesting technique used as an icebreaker of late, and that is to name your maternal grandmother or your maternal grandfather, and how hard it is in our culture often to do that. Those are unknown people. So it seemed to me that this probably represents a different time and culture when that was a point of pride and identity in ways that it no longer is. So it might make more sense there.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I was thinking, that maybe a person now who would want to learn, either that it's just a challenge, like learning Jesus' genealogy or something.
Yeah,
But also maybe, if they learn that, they almost become a part of the story and the family, because they can really do it.
The other thing is that I'm watching you, but there's a timeline. So I'm actually watching you here a minute or two ago, or you're up there. And sometimes it's very confusing because you use a repertoire of gestures that are repeating. And so your words sometimes would fit what you're doing on the screen a minute ago, even as you were doing that. So the point here is that there's a cadence and a library of gestures that all of us use subliminally almost.
Right.
I suspect that they constitute another kind of register. I'm not sure that it fits any of those that used to organize. So you talk, and we can almost see you thinking from time to time, making sure that what I'm going to say next is the next part of that story. But we all do that, and we can see that. But part of it is the cadence and the gestures. That's the reason. It has something to do, I think, probably with music, psalms and poetry, so that if you have a structure on which to hang the words, which is the melody, then
That's
you can learn more songs.
Yeah. But music itself helps you remember things.
Yeah.
I can remember the stories from Jesus Christ Superstar a whole lot more easily than I can from the text.
Yeah. And the songs.
Right, exactly.
Yep.
And every once in a while you freeze. I don't know why.
Oh.
You mean in the transmission there?
Yeah.
Well, it's because it runs out of
Loading.
data stream and has to record stuff for a while. Yeah, well, another thing that I do, I'll just name this, and it happened 2 or 3 minutes ago, is that I may forget what the link is that I'm going to talk about. So just before I was going to say Jesus was the master of exaggeration, I was starting to say that, and someone else said something, and I lost that track. I just started talking, and it took 3 or 4 words before I remembered. And I sometimes will do that.
Oh my gosh.
It's terrible.
Tom was told the whole Gospel of Mark once in Texas. And we were experimenting, and we were projecting images behind him, and it was real projection. So I was back with the computer. What else did I hear? Going on and on and on and making stuff. And I knew what had happened. He'd kind of forgotten, and he was keeping the mouth going, and he was talking, and it was making sense. And they're not reading along in their Bibles, but
I was a few times.
I
I got a Bible, I don't know.
I was just chuckling to myself.
You like all that spitting and slapping stuff off. After the first time.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's there or not, or just adding for effect.
So
Don't,
sometimes
don't
it
lose
takes-
your cool, you
Yeah,
know.
that's right. Well, because sometimes it takes a while for long-term memory to kick in.
Yeah.
So one thing to do is just keep talking, I guess. Sometimes that works. That may not be all that trustworthy.
Yeah.
So any other questions or comments about a trained memory and how memory works?
Ways that, I mean, you learn stories, other ways that people
Yeah.
learn stories.
Yeah.
I know I'm a newcomer, so I've learned many different techniques, and I've heard some do's and don'ts, and everyone has their own way of doing things. So I do them in large print and chunk them in ways that are episodic for me, and then I read them in the car. So, and I know people say don't meditate in the car,
Yeah.
but I have them in plastic binder or plastic protector sheets, and so I just recite them as I drive. And if I forget something, I just have to pick it up. It's 14-point font because it's those catchwords. And I'm not sure if this comes from school days, but when the story is laid out, it's like, can you get through the first paragraph? And now add the next one.
Yeah.
And you start from the top and just keep cycling back until you've got the whole thing. So
That's what I do.
it's, and then the moment of telling it goes panic. and then you have to start with the skeleton again and get the key words.
Right. One of the things that I regularly tell people in Grace by Heart is when you're starting a story is to first of all stand still, feel your feet on the floor, all the way through the floor to the earth, and take a breath. Because what that does is to activate memory. Whereas if you're moving around, you're distracted, you're not focused, you're not paying attention. It's also that if you look up things at the people to whom you're going to tell the story, it can happen that will be an interference that suddenly, whoop, and there can be a memory blank for a moment because you're paying attention to them, which you need to do. But if you haven't made the connection in your mind already, when you look up, it can make it more difficult to remember where the story starts. So that's just a basic, I don't know, technique for storytelling. Is first of all, to feel your feet on the floor, to breathe, and then look at those to whom you're going to tell the story, and practice that beforehand, imagining people there, because that in turn provides a link when you're actually going to do it, so that you're not panicked by looking up and there are 500 people or 3 or whatever with these big eyes waiting for you to tell the story, and no, because I've had that happen.
The trick I use for that point is, my final piece of that is I want to tell you a story that's in my head.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to tell, that's the process, right? So
Yeah,
you're
I want to tell
grounding
you a story.
yourself,
Yeah.
and there's a mental space of I want to tell you a story.
It's a fun time.
Yeah, and I think that takes the edge off. It's not an Oscar performance, it's I want to tell you a story. And that's it, reminding you what you're here for,
Yeah,
you know, and it was fun and it was important, or you're gonna love it. So, just, and that's the transition for me.
Now, one of the things that one of the functions of this session, I hope Mark identified it, is training the trainers. My hope is that all of you will become, and are already, but more so, people who will initiate others in learning and telling biblical stories. Specifically, my vision, out of my experience at Grace now for 7 years, is that we have told the stories by heart in every worship service. All of the stories, prophecies, psalms, everything of the recital of the scriptures by heart for that entire period. And it has been a major source of renewal and energy for the congregation and for those who have been doing it. And there are probably now, I don't know, 30 some people who have been involved at various points in telling stories of grace over the last 7 years. I would recommend that for every local church, that there be a group that commit themselves to telling the scriptures by heart every week. It transforms the experience of the scriptures in worship and brings greater vitality, energy, life, attention, and just sheer pleasure. People just really enjoy it. I don't know how long it will be sustained, but people will never want to go back to reading from the manuscript because it lacks the vitality and interest that is present when the story is told. So my recommendation would be that this center become a place where pastors and leaders of congregations, lay people who are leaders, would learn processes for enabling the congregation to become a storytelling church. That is, where the scriptures are told by heart. And the fact is that once you get that group in place and they've trained their memories, it's not a big deal. We have no problem about getting people to sign up. In fact, they look forward to it. And sometimes we'll have a contest, between somebody who wants to tell the story and somebody else wants to do it. We have to negotiate who's going to do it and so on. So that's really fun.
In the summer conference that we attended last year, there were 4 tellings of a passage in Revelation. 4 different people. And everyone was extremely distinctive.
Yeah.
One was condemnatory, and there was one that was pitiable. It was lament. You were there, I think. Yeah. Those were.
One with attitude.
Yeah, that was
Right.
That was the one that I thought was.
Yeah, it's almost like they got together and decided how greatly different they were going to be.
They didn't. I'm sure. But
they did.
But that happens.
Okay, well, it was 8:30.
So we're gonna hear straight tonight? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
So any other things about I'll say a couple more things about starting a scripture by heart group in a congregation. First is to do it a few times yourself so that the congregation has some experience of it. And then to identify 2 or 3 people who you know would be interested and talk to them personally. Then make a public announcement. I'm going to have a course on learning and telling the scriptures by heart, and I want to invite everybody to the congregation to come. No commitment, but start talking about it, and at the end, get people to sign up for then the next series. And start the process. Sometimes it's 1 a month, but it's better simply to start and say, starting at Advent or whenever, we're going to tell the stories about all of them. And if you can get 6 people, that's enough to start. So,
Yeah, this really is important to me because I can do things like I've been